judge mocks young woman in court, then freezes when he realizes she's a genius lawyer fighting for her grandmother. The courtroom was packed. Rows of spectators whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, others chuckling under their breath. At the center of it all stood Emily Carter, a young woman no older than 20, dressed in a plain navy blue suit that seemed slightly too big for her. She clutched a leather-bound folder close to her chest, her posture firm but undeniably nervous. At the judge's bench sat Judge Raymond Holston, a man in his late 60s with sharp, scrutinizing eyes and a reputation for having no patience for nonsense. His gavel rested in his hand as he adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the documents before him. He sighed, then looked directly at Emily. "Miss Carter, let me see if I understand correctly. You're here to represent the plaintiff in this case?" His tone dripped with skepticism. Emily cleared her throat, trying to steady her voice. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "And where, may I ask, did you pass the bar?" "Middle school." Laughter rippled through the courtroom. Emily didn't flinch. She had expected this. She had prepared for this. From the other side of the room, a well-dressed man in his 50s, Charles Latimer, smirked. He was the lead attorney for the defense, a man known for steamrolling weaker opponents and crushing cases before they even began. "Your Honor, I must say," Latimer began with exaggerated politeness, "I admire this young lady's enthusiasm. But surely a matter of this importance requires someone with, shall we say, real legal experience." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Emily's knuckles tightened around her folder. Judge Holston tapped his gavel lightly. "Miss Carter, before we proceed any further, may I ask, who exactly is your client?" Emily took a slow breath, then turned to look at the frail woman sitting at the plaintiff's table. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the arms of her wheelchair. "Her grandmother, Evelyn Carter." "I'm representing my grandmother, Your Honor. And I intend to prove that she's been the victim of fraud and wrongful eviction." The laughter in the courtroom faded. A few people leaned forward in their seats. Suddenly, this didn't seem like a joke anymore. Judge Holston, however, remained unimpressed. He exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temple as if he were already exhausted. "Miss Carter, I suggest you reconsider before you make a fool of yourself. This is not a school debate. If you don't know what you're doing, you could lose everything for your grandmother." Emily's heart pounded, but she stood firm. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I know exactly what I'm doing." The courtroom fell into a brief, stunned silence. Judge Holston raised an eyebrow. He had no idea just how wrong he was about her. The courtroom remained silent for a long moment. Emily stood tall, her unwavering gaze fixed on Judge Holston. The judge studied her, as if waiting for her confidence to crack. But it didn't. With an exasperated sigh, he adjusted his glasses and turned his attention to the defense. "Mr. Latimer, let's hear your argument first." Charles Latimer smirked. "Gladly, Your Honor." He stood, buttoning his expensive charcoal suit before pacing slowly toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a simple case," he began, his voice smooth and practiced. "The defendant, Mr. Howard Kensington, is the rightful owner of the building where Mrs. Evelyn Carter resides. Due to her failure to meet contractual obligations, she was rightfully evicted. This is not a matter of fraud. It is a matter of contract law." Emily clenched her jaw. He made it sound so reasonable, so clean. Latimer gestured toward Evelyn, who sat quietly, hands folded in her lap. "Now, I have nothing but sympathy for the elderly Mrs. Carter," he said with an almost convincing tone of concern. "But emotions do not override the law. She signed an agreement. She failed to uphold her end of the bargain. And now her granddaughter, with no real legal experience, believes she can stand here and argue otherwise." Laughter spread through the courtroom again, but Emily barely heard it. Her mind was locked onto every word he said. Judge Holston turned to Emily. "Miss Carter, do you have a response?" Emily took a steady breath and stepped forward. "Yes, Your Honor." She turned to the jury, scanning their faces, making sure they were listening. "Mr. Latimer is correct about one thing. This is indeed a simple case." She let the words settle before continuing. "But not for the reasons he just outlined. The real issue here is whether or not my grandmother was deceived into signing away her home under false pretenses." Latimer's smirk faded just slightly. Emily lifted a stack of papers from her folder, and walked toward the bench, handing them to the bailiff. "These are copies of the original lease agreement. And this," she flipped to the next page, "is a forensic analysis of a second contract, one that Mr. Kensington claims my grandmother signed, agreeing to new, unfair terms." She turned back toward the judge. "But here's the problem, Your Honor, the signatures don't match." A low murmur rippled through the room. Latimer's eyes narrowed. He hadn't expected this. Judge Holston adjusted his glasses, examining the documents. He was silent for a long moment before finally speaking. "You're claiming that this contract was forged?" Emily met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor. And I can prove it." The courtroom erupted in whispers, the mood shifting dramatically. For the first time since the trial began, Latimer no longer looked so confident. And Judge Holston? He was no longer laughing. The tension in the courtroom thickened as Judge Holston examined the documents in front of him. The whispers in the gallery had died down, replaced by a heavy silence. The weight of Emily's claim that her grandmother's eviction was based on a forged document had shifted the entire mood of the trial. Charles Latimer, who had previously worn a smug expression, now looked visibly irritated. He cleared his throat and forced a smile. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is a bold accusation coming from someone with no real legal experience." A handwriting discrepancy? Hardly a smoking gun. Emily didn't flinch. Instead, she took a step forward. "Mr. Latimer, I appreciate your concern, but I wouldn't make a claim like this without evidence." She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to call an expert witness to the stand, Professor Daniel Whitmore, a forensic handwriting analyst with over 30 years of experience." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Latimer's eyes flickered with a brief flash of concern, but he quickly covered it with a scoff. "An expert witness? From a law student?" He turned to the judge. "This is ridiculous. Surely, we're not indulging this circus act." Judge Holston, however, held up a hand. He wasn't laughing anymore. "I'll allow it," he said, nodding toward the doors. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a distinguished-looking man in a gray suit walked in, carrying a briefcase. His presence alone seemed to shift the energy in the room. Professor Whitmore took the stand, and after being sworn in, Emily approached him with a calm, measured pace. "Professor Whitmore, can you explain your findings regarding these signatures?" The professor adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Certainly. I analyzed both signatures, one from Mrs. Carter's original lease and one from the revised contract. Using digital magnification and stroke comparison, I found clear evidence of forgery in the second document. The pressure inconsistencies, unnatural angles, and lack of fluency in the strokes suggest that Mrs. Carter's signature was traced or altered by another hand." Judge Holston leaned forward slightly. "And you're confident in this analysis?" "Beyond any reasonable doubt, Your Honor." Latimer shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "This is preposterous," he snapped. "Even if the signature is inconsistent, that doesn't prove fraud. It could be a result of age, illness, or any number of factors." Emily, still calm, turned back to the expert. "Professor Whitmore, in your professional experience, could age or health issues account for these inconsistencies?" Whitmore shook his head. "No. A natural signature, even if affected by age, retains certain unique identifiers. This document was deliberately altered." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs again. Judge Holston stroked his chin, deep in thought. Latimer could feel control slipping from his hands. Emily took a deep breath, then faced the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, my grandmother was manipulated into signing away her home based on fraudulent paperwork. But we're not done yet. There's something even more disturbing about this case, something that will reveal just how deep this deception goes." Latimer stiffened. Judge Holston's eyes narrowed. "Miss Carter, explain." Emily met his gaze, her voice unwavering. "This wasn't just a forgery, Your Honor. It was a setup. And I can prove exactly who was behind it." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Judge Holston adjusted his glasses. For the first time since the trial began, he looked at Emily not with amusement, but with genuine curiosity. What did this young woman know? And more importantly, what was she about to reveal? The weight of Emily's words hung in the air like an approaching storm. The jury members exchanged glances. Judge Holston tapped his gavel lightly, as if to break the courtroom's stunned silence. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice measured. "You just made a very serious claim. If you're alleging a setup, I expect you to back it up. Proceed. Emily nodded, stepping forward with controlled confidence. Your Honor, this case isn't just about a forged document. It's about a calculated attempt to strip my grandmother of her home for financial gain. The lease was altered, but more importantly, the person who presented it knew exactly what they were doing. She turned sharply toward the defense table, her eyes locked onto Charles Latimer. And that person was Mr. Latimer's own client, Howard Kensington. The courtroom exploded with whispers. Latimer's face twisted with forced amusement. Your Honor, this is outrageous. She's throwing out baseless accusations in a desperate attempt to save a losing case. Emily didn't even blink. She turned to the bailiff. Your Honor, I'd like to submit new evidence into the record. Judge Holston sighed, rubbing his temple. Let's see it. The bailiff took a thick envelope from Emily's folder and carried it to the bench. Judge Holston eyed the contents carefully, flipping through a series of printed emails and legal documents. As he read, his expression darkened. Emily turned back to the jury, her voice steady. These are internal emails from Kensington's property management office, obtained through a subpoena. In them, you'll see multiple conversations between Mr. Kensington and his legal team, strategizing ways to remove my grandmother from her home. She took a step closer, scanning the faces of the jurors. One email, dated 2 months before the eviction notice, explicitly states that Mrs. Carter was unlikely to fight back because, and I quote, her age and financial status make her an easy target. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Latimer jumped to his feet. Your Honor, these emails don't prove forgery. At most, they suggest aggressive business tactics, which... Emily raised her voice, just enough to cut through his interruption. And yet, Mr. Kensington's signature appears on a document stating that my grandmother agreed to a rent increase she never even saw. Alongside that, we have bank records proving that 3 days after the eviction notice was served, an anonymous wire transfer was made to Kensington's account, a sum suspiciously close to the new tenant's first payment. Judge Holston snapped his attention to Latimer. Mr. Latimer, do you have an explanation for this? For the first time, Latimer didn't answer immediately. He was flipping through his own papers, scrambling for a response. Kensington, seated beside him, had gone pale. Emily wasn't finished. Your Honor, this isn't just about my grandmother. Mr. Kensington and his firm have done this before. I have testimonies from 3 former tenants, 2 of whom were also elderly, who experienced the same fraudulent lease modifications before being pushed out of their homes. The courtroom erupted again. Judge Holston raised his gavel and slammed it down hard. Order. Order in the court. But the damage was done. The spectators weren't whispering anymore. They were outright furious. Emily turned toward Kensington, her eyes sharp. You thought my grandmother wouldn't fight back. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. You were wrong. Latimer turned toward his client, muttering in urgent, hushed tones, but Kensington just sat there, staring at the table, his hands clenched together. Judge Holston sighed deeply and set the documents down. He looked at Emily differently now, no longer as an inexperienced young woman, but as an opponent who had just turned the entire case upside down. And the trial was far from over. The courtroom was no longer a place of quiet deliberation. It was a battlefield. Emily had just shattered the illusion of an open-and-shut case, exposing Howard Kensington's pattern of fraudulent evictions. But she knew the defense wouldn't go down without a fight. Judge Holston set the documents down with a heavy sigh, rubbing his temple. Mr. Latimer, do you wish to respond? Latimer stood, smoothing his suit, but his confidence had cracks in it now. Your Honor, this so-called evidence is nothing more than speculation. Emails without context, bank transactions with no verified source. This is a weak attempt to assassinate my client's character, nothing more. Emily turned to face him. If Mr. Kensington denies his involvement, I have a simple solution. She stepped toward the judge. Let's subpoena his financial records and the lease agreements for his other properties. If this was all a coincidence, those documents will prove it. A flicker of panic crossed Kensington's face. Latimer clenched his jaw. Your Honor, my client has no obligation to indulge in a fishing expedition orchestrated by an unqualified. Judge Holston held up a hand, silencing him. I'll decide what's necessary, Mr. Latimer. But before I make that call, I want to hear from your side. He leaned forward, his gaze sharp. Do you have any witnesses prepared? Latimer hesitated for just a second, but Emily caught it. That meant he wasn't expecting to be put on the spot. Then his eyes flickered with something new. Desperation. Actually, Your Honor, we do. He turned and gestured toward the back of the courtroom. The defense calls Timothy Wallace to the stand. Emily's stomach dropped. Timothy Wallace was the property manager for Kensington's firm, and she knew exactly why Latimer had called him. This wasn't about proving Kensington's innocence. This was about discrediting her. Wallace, a stout man in a gray suit, took the stand with a knowing smirk. After being sworn in, Latimer wasted no time. Mr. Wallace, do you have any prior knowledge of Miss Carter? Wallace leaned into the microphone. Yes, sir. I do. He turned toward Emily, his eyes gleaming. And I know for a fact she's hiding something. A sharp wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Emily stiffened. She knew exactly what was coming next, and it could change everything. Emily's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay composed. She couldn't let them see any hesitation. Judge Holston adjusted his glasses. Mr. Wallace, elaborate. What exactly is Miss Carter hiding? Wallace shifted in his seat, savoring the moment. Your Honor, Miss Carter applied for a clerkship position at Kensington Properties 6 months ago. A wave of whispers swept through the courtroom. Emily froze. She hadn't expected them to bring this up. Latimer turned to her with mock sympathy. Miss Carter, isn't it true that you sought employment with the very company you're accusing of fraud? Emily's mind raced. She couldn't afford to let them twist this. She took a slow breath. Yes, Your Honor, I did apply. And I withdrew my application the moment I saw how Kensington treated his tenants. Latimer raised an eyebrow. How convenient. Emily ignored him and turned back to the jury. I was a law student looking for experience. I had no idea what kind of unethical practices were happening at Kensington Properties until I started researching their cases. And when I did, I walked away. Latimer smirked. Walked away or got rejected? Gasps rippled through the gallery. Emily felt a sharp sting of anger, but she refused to show it. Mr. Latimer, she said, her voice steady, are you suggesting that I fabricated an entire case out of spite over a job I didn't even want? Latimer held his smirk, but said nothing. Emily turned back to Wallace. Tell me, Mr. Wallace, if you knew I applied for the job, then you must have also seen my withdrawal email. Wallace shifted uncomfortably. Emily took a step forward. Would you like me to submit it as evidence? A hush fell over the room. Wallace swallowed hard. He knew she had just trapped him. Judge Holston leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. Mr. Latimer, unless you have actual evidence proving misconduct by Miss Carter, I suggest we move on. Latimer's jaw tightened. He had lost this round. But Emily wasn't celebrating yet. She knew Latimer had one last move to play. And whatever it wasn't going to be fair. Latimer's smirk had faded, but his eyes still gleamed with something dangerous. He wasn't finished. Not yet. He cleared his throat, adjusting his tie as he turned back to the judge. Your Honor, if Miss Carter insists on questioning my client's ethics, then it's only fair we examine her own credibility. Emily's muscles tensed. Here it comes. Latimer picked up a folder from the defense table and held it up dramatically. I have here a sworn affidavit from a former professor of Miss Carter's, calling her unprofessional, reckless, and prone to emotional outbursts. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Emily kept her expression neutral, but inside anger burned. Judge Holston raised an eyebrow. Do you intend to submit that into evidence, Mr. Latimer? Latimer grinned. I do, Your Honor. He handed it to the bailiff, who placed it in front of the judge. Emily knew exactly who had written it. Professor Harding. A bitter, old man who had never believed she had what it took to practice law. She had challenged him in class, proved him wrong too many times, and he had resented her for it. Judge Holston sighed as he read the document. Miss Carter, care to respond? Emily stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. Your Honor, my record speaks for itself. I graduated at the top of my class, passed the bar early, and have never received a formal complaint. Professor Harding, however, has a history of dismissing female students who challenge him. Latimer shook his head mockingly. Ah, yes, the he just didn't like me defense. How original. Emily ignored him. Your Honor, I'd like to submit my academic transcripts as evidence, as well as statements from 4 other former students who experienced the same treatment from Harding. Judge Holston took a deep breath, rubbing his temple. Finally, he looked at Latimer. This affidavit is irrelevant to the case at hand. I'm dismissing it from evidence. Latimer's jaw tightened. Emily had won again, but she knew he was out of moves now. And that meant one thing. It was time to end this. The courtroom had changed. The whispers, the laughter, the sneers, they were gone. Emily had deflected every attack the defense had thrown at her. And now it was her turn to end this. She turned to the jury, her voice steady and deliberate. Ladies and gentlemen, we've heard a lot today. We've seen forged documents, secret emails, and a desperate attempt to discredit both me and my grandmother. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. But what we haven't heard, what Mr. Kensington and his attorney have avoided at every turn, is a real explanation. She turned, her gaze piercing into Kensington's. Mr. Kensington, if you truly had nothing to hide, why not explain the bank transactions? Why not allow an independent forensic analysis of the documents? Why not testify under oath right now? Kensington shifted uncomfortably, sweat beading on his forehead. Latimer stood quickly. Objection, Your Honor. My client is under no obligation to testify. Judge Holston held up a hand. Sit down, Mr. Latimer. The courtroom fell silent again. Emily stepped toward the jury, her final words measured and strong. This case is about more than a lease. It's about greed. It's about men like Howard Kensington believing they can take advantage of people like my grandmother simply because they think no one will fight back. She turned to her grandmother, Evelyn, whose eyes glistened with quiet strength. But she did fight back. And today, we all have the chance to show that justice isn't reserved for the wealthy. That the law protects everyone, even an elderly woman who just wanted to stay in the home she's lived in for over 40 years. Emily let out a slow breath. The defense says this is a simple case. I agree. The choice is simple. Do what's right. She stepped back, hands at her sides. Her job was done. Judge Holston nodded slowly, then turned to the jury. We'll now proceed to deliberation. Emily sat beside her grandmother, taking her frail hand in hers. No matter what happened next, she knew one thing for sure. She had already won. If this story moved you, imagine how many real people face injustices like this every day. Fighting for what's right isn't easy, but standing up for others can change lives. What would you have done in Emily's place? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe in justice, fairness, and standing up for those who need it most, don't forget to like and share this story. Subscribe for more powerful stories that will inspire, challenge, and remind you that doing the right thing always matters.